All right, welcome to the Church Dropout podcast. My name is Alan. I'm the host. Thank you so much for tuning in. Church Dropout is a podcast. We talk about issues, topics, and teachings related to faith, life, and culture in ways that are sometimes funny, sometimes serious, but always insightful. If you haven't already, please like, rate, and subscribe to the channel. Please drop a comment below. Keep the conversation moving forward. So I just wanted to jump on and talk a little bit about this ongoing, unfolding situation with Daystar, with Jonathan and Suzy Lamb, and this whole situation that continually unfolds. And I wanted to talk about it. And the main question I want to, talk through today is in reference to Johnny and Suzy. And the question is are they victims, villains, or a part of the machine? Are they victims, villains, or a part of the machine? And I think that this is an important question to ask at this point. You know, they did an interview, I don't know what it was, with Marcus Rogers. And I think that was, I think it highlighted some of the issues, at least that I've had and some others that I've spoken to, within this situation that seemed to be being overlooked and really just raised some concerns. And so I don't want to talk about the interview itself, although that might be worth discussing. I kind of want to talk about this idea of how do we see them in this whole situation, right? And I think that's getting lost, right? The tragedy of the situation, obviously a SA being involved, child, different things of that sort. But I think there's some things that are being lost, and I want to talk about that. And right now, I think for the most part that Jonathan and Suzy are being seen as martyrs. This idea that they are martyrs, right? I think even in the interview, the analogy was used, or they were made analogous to, David and Goliath. Like, this is David taking on Goliath, that here these two individuals are taking on this, huge conglomerate known as Daystar. They're fighting Daystar, and that somehow, this is kind of a David and Goliath situation, and they're martyrs, right? They're falling on the sword in this particular situation, and they're fighting this huge conglomerate that is aiming to destroy them and destroy people, and they're being seen as the martyr. And I think this is dangerous. I think this is dangerous. I think this has been the narrative that has been put out there. Not that they are not victims or anything like that, but that, they are somehow martyrs in this, that they're doing what others could not do or have not been able to do. And they're standing against this. And I'll talk a little bit about that more later. But this is dangerous, right? And I want to say just a few things with regards to this. This is dangerous because I think when we make people martyrs, especially in these types of situations, we tend to lose sight of accountability, right? We tend to lose sight of their part in this, right? Because they have been made martyrs, right? So there's a loss of accountability when we crown people as martyrs in situations like this. Second, they can exploit and be exploited for personal gain. And this is happening all over the place. One, they can exploit the situation for personal gain. When they're made to be a martyr, this becomes a launching point for them to do what they want to do or to do something else. So they can actually exploit the situation knowingly and unknowingly. And then they can also be exploited, right, for personal gain, right? Everybody wants to be a part of the story, and they want to be on the side of the martyr. And to be honest, that's kind of like what it felt like. The interview kind of felt like to me, again, just from the references that were used, here's this huge, enemy, and here these two individuals are in place to fight it, and people are quote unquote profiting from that that relationship. And then lastly, it leads to, and I've seen this a whole lot, is this false sense of purpose, right? That their purpose now has become to tear down these walls, and God is using us to do this great work. And I'm not saying that God is not using this situation. I'm just saying that it ultimately leads to this false sense of purpose, this purpose worship that ends up happening where now they have to do this. This is a mission from God, and we got to do X, Y, and Z. And I think this is dangerous for all three of these things when they're lumped together, right? Like how accountability, personal accountability is overlooked, the loss of accountability, how they can exploit and be exploited because of this particular situation. And then this false sense of purpose, right? This purpose worship in situations like this, where people find a purpose and attach themselves to that purpose and continue to move in line with that. That becomes how their identity. And so it leads to this false sense of purpose that they're there to do this thing. And that's what this situation to me is becoming. And so right now we see them as martyrs, but I want to kind of walk through this idea of, whether or not they are victims, villains, and or a part of the machine. And I think personally that they are all three. To be honest with you, I think they are all three. And so I just want to walk through this, just my observations on this situation, kind of walk through it. Now, again, this is not a personal attack on Jonathan and Suzy. This is strictly from what's been publicly said, right? And what's publicly on display. And this is the problem with and I felt this way from the beginning. Like, it's one thing to get the story out there. It's one thing to share the situation, but it's another thing to kind of go on a campaign and to begin to, share this over and over. And then, being very selective as to what platforms, you're sharing this stuff on, and different things of that sort. I just think that, again, it's a very interesting situation. But anyway, let me get into it. I think they're all three. And this is all, kind of just from what I've witnessed in this total situation. So first, they're not just seen as martyrs, they're seen as victims. They're not just seen as martyrs, they're being seen as victims, right? And this is true. I do think that they are victims in this situation, okay? And if you listen to the interviews, all of them, and you listen to how they've shared their story, this is two individuals who have been spiritually abused. They've been in an environment where there is heavy authoritarian structure. They have been manipulated spiritually, especially in terms of, believing that the word of the Lord rests on this individual. And they've been hurt tremendously by this abusive environment. And so we need to understand that the two people that are talking are not martyrs, or not just martyrs, they're victims. Like, the two people that are talking are victims. When I was listening to them speak, and they were talking about, as Suzy was saying, like, she said herself that, she was under this strong sense of authority and felt like she had to listen, even at the expense of her own family and at the expense of their own livelihood and relationships and different things of that sort, where they felt so spiritually led to follow. And this is, what this environment is displaying. We're seeing now that this was not an environment that was conducive of spreading the gospel. This was an environment that was very controlled, that was heavily based on influence, and that operated in a sense of spiritual abuse, to where people were actually being hurt by it. And again, this all, flows down through the things that were happening in terms of being asked to sign NDAs and, them not wanting to expose the marriage and different things of that sort, because they were wrestling with the nature of the relationship, one being family, but they were also wrestling with the nature of the spiritual authority that had been displayed and had been demonstrated in their lives, that this, should we do this, or is this right? Or, anyway, so they are two individuals that have been victimized in this situation. And we got to be careful, right? Because, now is not a time, in my opinion, now is not a time to build for them. Now is the time to heal and to understand and to grow. You see where the pitfalls were, because they said it over and over again about listening, and obeying, and even to a fault. Now is the time to correct those things and get those things straight. It's not a time to build, or it's not a time to continually be in the spotlight. Now is the time to kind of, retreat and to, seek God and to really figure out what this is, and look at the situation for what it is, and see how the situation hurt you and potentially has hurt others in the past when you were a part of that, and begin to seek healing and understanding of what it means to truly be in a healthy ministry environment, not only for yourself, but for the people who follow you, and for your healing, right? And so we're dealing with two individuals here who've been hurt, who have been victimized by the church. They are victims. They have been spiritually abused, and we got to be careful of putting people on a pedestal who are hurt, because we know that hurt people, right? This can become a cycle, and I'm not saying that that's what's going to happen or anything like that, but we can't just lift them up. We shouldn't just lift them up as martyrs and not realize that what they are communicating is something that they were affected heavily by, and that they are in part victims. So they're not just martyrs, they are victims, right? The second thing is that they're not just victims, they're also villains. They're not just victims, they're also villains. And I don't mean that in a malicious way, right? But they are villains. In this situation, Johnny has been marked as the villain, right? And rightly so. Okay. There are some things there that are off, very off, and need to be corrected. And you guys, if you've been following, you know the story. But they were in part complicit in this ministry's abuse. Now, I'm not talking about the physical abuse or the essay of the child. That's not what I'm talking about. But I am talking about this spiritually abusive environment. They themselves were a part of it. They themselves were Daystar, and they would be Daystar today if given the opportunity. And I think this is some of the stuff that was expressed in that conversation with Marcus. And I'll talk about that a little bit at the end. But the reality is that they are also part villain, right? They are a part of the problem, right? Now, remember, they were a part of Daystar. And this was brought out by many. One person, Adrian, who in Christ with Adrian, you could check out her channel. And I think it was also brought out by Joe Bahoda in one of his lives on this as well. This is probably not the only instance where people have been mistreated by this ministry. Maybe not to the degree of SA, but spiritual abuse. This is not done in a vacuum. There's probably other stories and instances of this happening, and it probably happened while they were there on staff and a part of that. Right. And so it's not until this situation took a turn and the situation got to where it is today that these things were called out. But the reality is that they were internal to that organization and the inner workings of that organization. And they knew the key players who were in this particular position. And they themselves have said they've been wrestling with this spiritual authority, this abusive authority for some time now. So this was an abusive environment. And if they were suffering this, imagine what other people in that organization were also suffering. So not only are they victims, they're also villains, in part because they are a part of the same organization that ended up abusing them. You understand what I'm saying? And so they're not only victims, they're also villains. And here's the part that's very interesting. And this is, again, this will go into my last point about the machine. But, they were not looking to, and I still believe this, they're not looking to destroy Daystar. That was never the case. This is, and I'm getting into the last one. So let me just go ahead and get into it. So not only are they, so they're not martyrs, they're victims. Not only are they victims, they're villains. And not only are they're villain, not only are they villains, they are also a part of the machine. Okay. So not only are they villains, they're also a part of the machine, right? This is a family feud, right? And let me explain that, because I don't mean family feud just in terms of like Johnny and Jonathan are related. I'm talking about this is an internal fight. This is a divided kingdom, right? And this is why it sounded, very silly to me when they were saying this is a David and Goliath type thing. No, David and Goliath are clearly on two different sides. This is a fight within Daystar. This is a family battle, right? It's clear that Jonathan and his wife would go back to Daystar if things were to able to be straight. And this is the problem. This is why I feel like the body to some degree has been deceived in this situation into seeing only certain parts of the situation, right? Because what comes out of this? Like, what happens next? And they are planning to do something. This has been their whole life. If not Daystar, something else. And the problem that I think we got to be careful of is that we are platforming the next Daystar, right? And if we believe that there are some harmful things that are happening at Daystar, not only from the spiritual authority perspective, but also from the doctrinal perspective, then we got to be careful how this story gets platformed. Right? Because again, their fight is not with Daystar. They would still be at Daystar if the situation didn't go to the extent that it went. If he wasn't forced to sign an NDA and different things of this sort, but they would still be at Daystar if the situation didn't unfold this way. So the fight is not against Daystar. This is not David and Goliath. This is a divided kingdom. This is a family feud. This is a situation where they have two different ideals and situations and understandings of what should happen at Daystar. Now, again, I know all of the other things that are going on, like with the SA, like there's personal things that are involved there. I'm not disputing that. But what's clear from that interview is that the enemy is not Daystar. That's not the enemy. You understand what I'm saying? That's not the enemy. The enemy is the way Johnny is handling this situation and her new husband. Daystar is not the problem. So you're not talking about two different entities that are going at war. You're talking about a fight within the same entity, right? And so, yeah, like I said, this is a family affair, right? In one sense, as they are quote unquote exposing what's happening at Daystar, they are exposing themselves because they're actually a part of the same. They were a part of the same environment or community that actually functioned this way. They were a part of that same thing. And I'm not saying that they were the ones who were doing it, but the reality is that, again, these types of things don't happen in vacuums. And so, again, I just wanted to share some thoughts. I know it's kind of all over the place, but the reality is this. Right now, we got to be careful of seeing them as martyrs, right? Right. As if they're individuals who have fallen on the sword in this particular situation, because there are consequences to that. That's dangerous. And it's really dangerous to people who have been hurt, because out of that comes this mission mentality where they feel empowered and used by God. And instead of getting healthy, they get popular. And what ends up happening is that they end up doing more damage. This is not the time to elevate people and to make them the face for something. So the martyr thing is a problem. And not only are they martyrs, they're also victims. These are two people who have been tremendously hurt spiritually by false doctrine, by a false gospel that declared people the voice of God in their lives that they were under for a long time, right? To the point where they were risking relationships, key relationships in their own immediate family to maintain relationship with this community. That's a problem. These are hurt people, and we're not doing them any justice if we overlook their hurt in order to make them martyrs and to make them popular. So they're not only martyrs, they're victims. But in their victimhood, they're also villains because they were a part of the same organization that has been behaving this way for a long time. He was the VP. And if they were putting trackers in his car as the VP, you didn't know that they were putting trackers in other people's cars? What type of organization is this? If they were forcing you to sign an NDA, did anybody else sign an NDA? Right? Was this stuff happening while you were on staff? Do you have any information on this stuff? Right. So what I'm saying is that they are a part of the same thing that they've been victimized by, and they're not looking to separate themselves from that. The enemy is not Daystar. That's not the enemy. The enemy is Johnny and her husband. Daystar is not the problem to them. Right. And so not only are they not just victims, they're also villains to a certain degree. But also, not only are they villains, they're a part of the machine. Daystar is a global powerhouse. It's not a ministry. It is a global powerhouse that has benefited from their influence, right? And unfortunately, this influence led to cover up. This influence led to abuse, and it led us to where we are today. And the problem that I have is it doesn't feel like they're separating themselves from Daystar. That's not the problem. And if we're not careful, we'll elevate people and they'll create the same type of problem that was there before. Right. And so we got to be careful. Right. We got to look at this from a holistic perspective. Obviously, things need to be brought to the surface. Obviously, things need to be talked about and talked through. That's not the problem. But when we start to talk about like, OK, wait a minute. They have not once denied anything that has to do with Daystar as a whole, because that's not the goal. They're not trying to destroy it. In fact, I think, again, that they would continue to have dealings with Daystar should things take a turn and go in a different direction. And then lastly, again, I the reason why this is important about the machine is that, and I'm going to close with this. I think it's clear that this is no longer about the SA, the NDA, the abuse. I think this has taken a turn where now this is starting to become about them and what God wants to do through them. And I know this is going to be unpopular. I know people will come at me for this, but I think we just ought to be careful for every reason that I mentioned, prior to this, is that this is becoming about something else, and it's not that they have some ill intentions in doing that. It could just be because people are continually asking them and continually platforming them and asking them to continue to share, and that they've become this leader. They become reluctant leaders in this. But the reality is that they have a next season that's going to lead somewhere. Right. And as the body of Christ, we should be concerned about what that looks like and what that is. Right. Because these issues are not just worked through, and if leaders were subject to this, then we also got to look at, okay, what does their leadership look like in the next season? And so anyway, there's so many questions, so many things here that we could talk about. I just wanted to kind of throw some things out there. These are more questions than they are, questions and concerns rather than, blanket statements. But the reality is that, this is a complex situation. It's a terrible situation because of people that were involved with the situation in terms of the innocent individuals. But now it's taken on something in and of itself that's much different than the way it started. And I think we ought to discern that, and we got to be careful of playing into this in a way that actually furthers what the problem is. And that is that the church has some issues. The way the body of Christ, the people of God, are functioning as Christ's church in the world, it's problematic. And these things are displaying that. And our discernment is low because we're stuck inside of this idea that the church is something that exists outside of God's people instead of being God's people, and that it's our responsibility to be the church in the world, and that all of these parachurch ministries, these big buildings, these mega communities and different things and that sort are not, how do I say this? It's not to say that they are sinful, but it is to say that it's distracting us from the true work that God has for us. And we got to fight against that. We got to be careful of creating celebrities, creating individuals that find themselves as leaders of people that they don't even know. And then we recreate the same issue that's happened before. And so anyway, love to hear your thoughts on this. Please drop a comment below. Keep the conversation moving forward. Like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Appreciate you tuning in to the Church Dropout. Talk to you soon. God bless.